Coogs House. The Houston Cougars went uncharacteristically ugly, even by their own standard, in a win over TCU, but they move on. That's the biggest thing, right?
You are Locked On Coogs, your daily podcast on the Houston Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Coogs, daily podcast about your Houston Cougars. I'm your host, Houston-born teacher and coach Parker Ainsworth, here to break down all things Cougs from a basement in the state of New York. It's a Wi-Fi hotspot, I'm sure. Anyway, thank you for joining us this morning from Locked On Coogs, bringing the latest on the Houston Cougars each and every day. Remember doing a giveaway at every 500 subscribers on YouTube. We are at about 2,100 almost. Hit subscribe, help us get there. Like, comment videos, let us know you're in that contest. If you don't know what to say, tell us, just because of where I'm sitting right now, do you have a basement? I think there's kind of rare in Texas, actually, certain part. Do you have a basement? All right, today's episode is going to be breaking down that ugly win over TCU and then moving very quickly on to looking forward to Texas Tech, because that's exactly how Houston Cougars have to handle it. And I do want to spend a segment at the end talking about dabbling in resting, because it does sound like Houston Cougars at least thought about that. Now, we got a lot to get to today, but we got to remind you that today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. More on that later. In this big win over TCU, first of all, Houston wins 60-45 if you weren't able to catch the game. Houston wins 60-45, and I think the score is the least surprising thing of the game. Houston opened up. TCU didn't score for nearly the first 10 minutes of the game. TCU shot 73 shots to Houston's 53. Houston shot 39.6% to TCU's 23.3%. TCU was 2 of 20 from 3, whereas they kind of lit it up from out there in the first matchup earlier this season. The only thing that really kept TCU in this game was their offensive rebounding. TCU managed to pull in 30 offensive rebounds. For reference, Houston had just 30 defensive rebounds. It was interesting to watch this game from an X's and O's perspective, because it felt like a lot of the same game plan pieces from when these two teams met up in the regular season. A lot of forcing of closeout contested threes. TCU again went 2 of 20 from 3. They were averaging more like 7 of 18 per game on the season. So contesting to make them more difficult, but obviously like that's the shot you're willing to give up against this team. If you're Houston, TCU, for what it's worth, only made 3 non-layup field goals in the entire game. The issue for Houston was all those putbacks, all those layups around the rim on putbacks, right? Those kinds of things from those offensive rebounds. If there was an issue, I should say that was the biggest one. TCU got 30 of those offensive rebounds. It was averaging 12 coming into the game. So even by their standards, it's a lot, a lot. Not just because they're playing, it's a lot. I do think it was interesting that even on those putbacks, Houston was able to contest those shots at the rim, keep that shooting percentage down. TCU just got so many looks that they were able to get to 45 points. And say able to, because there's a stretch of this game where it felt like they might not break 20. All kinds of graphics popping up about lowest points ever scored in a half, lowest points ever scored in a game at the Big 12 tournament. Felt like TCU was going to put all of that in jeopardy at some point in this basketball game. I do think it's also worth pointing out that Houston voluntarily went small. They did pull in Big Said Lot early in the first half with Francis not in foul trouble, so voluntarily put him in the first half as well. Said only played 10 minutes, and they played a lot of single big lineups. TCU was a very long team, a tall team. Manuel Miller playing the small forward for them. He's like 6'7", 6'8". Obviously, big Uday down low and 7-footer himself, right? So, idea of Houston playing small meant that obviously they're going to like give up some things, I guess. But they have such good guard rebounders. I think they've gotten away with that a lot this season. Was not able to be. That was not the case in the glass against TCU in this one. Wilson was the only guard in the offensive rebound. I think that kind of is indicative of the effort that Malik Wilson, that is, and I think that's indicative of the effort that Houston played with in this game on the glass. Houston able to pick it up with a lot of other things, and I think they frankly had focus, it looked like to me, on other things going into the game and didn't assume there'll be a problem, because why would that be a problem? It hadn't been a problem all year at this point, not to that degree anyway. Malik played very, very well, though. He has a great spark off the bench, energy off the bench. Only took 4 shots. I thought they were all very smart shots. Went 2 of 4 on those. 22 minutes of great defense. He had the 3 blocks, led the team in blocks, and 5 rebounds. And again, the Houston struggled to rebound the basketball. Damian Dunn, I thought, played very well in spurts off the bench as well for Houston. He had a pretty strong game for most of the game the first time these two teams played, and had the ultimately you can't forget it, the mistake to end the game when he didn't pass the ball back to Jamal on the final shot. I do think there were other parts of this game worth pointing out that they did offensive X and O's kind of stuff to get Jamal, Cryer, and Sharp different looks. They ran out of a horn set. They ran one look where they had Jamal coming off one screen and roll, and then a flare screen set up on the backside. Now, getting there on a horn set was an interesting kind of dive and then back up for the screen. A lot of extra action out of the post players. But they were able to get Sharp in the corner on a flare screen while having Jamal attacking the rim on a pick and roll with the other post. I thought that was an interesting look. They ran a couple different times, a couple different ways for Sharp each time, but I think what's interesting about Houston's lineup is you can run it for Sharp or Cryer to get them corner 3 on a kick out, skip pass. You could get J1 the ball up top, or in some instances they had Damian Dunn the ball up top. He's more of a guard type body too. And then you could obviously have the big Francis or Said. I don't think they ever ran with J1 as the 5, rolling to the rim. Lots of options for Jamal there in a set that, frankly, hadn't seen a whole lot of, if any, intentional times this year. And so it was interesting to see, okay, they are adding those kind of wrinkles. And I think those kinds of wrinkles and getting better using these lineups that they're just, frankly, having to adjust into and figure out in the last couple weeks of the season here. I think that's really the thing that must have been the focus going in, because there's no way you could have thought that just as the Houston Cougars men's program, you'd have had a rebounding issue like that, right? There's almost no way to think that oh yeah, we have to work on and focus on rebounding against TCU, because that wasn't the issue in the first game. It hadn't been the issue most of your games of the season. And frankly, from a cultural identity perspective, you feel like that's kind of built in. On the whole, I mean, again, Houston shot the ball well, not extraordinary. And frankly, had they cleaned up the rebounding and TCU's continued shot 23% or whatever, this game could have been much, much worse than it was for TCU. I do think the biggest thing is they got through it. They won it, got out healthy. They played Texas Tech on Friday night or Friday afternoon. They played on Friday. I should probably check that at some point. But I do think that as they play Tech on Friday, the biggest things to take away from the TCU game are just that you got out healthy, you got out okay, and no one's too dinged up or banged up. I said to say that a 15-point win is 15-point win, and so I get that people might be that's too doom and gloom or whatever. And I'm usually the optimistic guy of all your Houston Cougar podcasts. I'm being really honest. I like to be on the optimistic side of things, but on the whole, Emmanuel Sharp led Jawan Roberts led the team at 35 minutes. He had 3 starters over 30. But you also got 22 out of Wilson, 16 out of Dunn. You got about 10 out of Sedlot. I wonder if you can get more out of him against Tech. Tech has another true 7-footer, so you'd think that hey, he can, at least put some size down like we saw him do against Dickinson or whatever. I think that Sed can play in that game some too. Against BYU, you had Damian Dunn shoot 2 of 4 from 3. I guess Jamal Shed to 2 of 5, which is good. And frankly, he made the toughest one he shot. But truthfully, you're hoping moving forward that you get better than 4 out of 14 from the combination of Emmanuel Sharp and LJ Cryer. If one of those guys gets hot, you're really hard to cover, because that's just a sharp shooter, no pun intended, from a corner, top the key kind of stuff. Sharp made timely threes that kind of squelched runs from TCU, and frankly, for what it's worth, I thought the Sharp's couple drives to the basket were pretty strong as well. But you're hoping to get out of that combination better shooting, and that could have made this more like a 20, 25-point win because of after they make one or two shots, the way that the defense has to adjust. Now, if I'm going through that game really quickly, it's because I think that Houston should too. Houston's got 24 hours or so to turn it around and get ready for Texas Tech. And we're going to do the same on this podcast, give for Texas Tech in the next segment. But first, I do want to talk some about one of our newest buddies here at Locked On. That is Robin Hood. Did you know that even if you have a 401k for retirement, you still have to pay an IRA? Robinhood has the only IRA that gives you a 3% boost on every dollar you contribute when you subscribe to the Robinhood Gold. But get this, through April 30th, Robinhood is even boosting every single dollar you transfer in from other retirement accounts with a 3% match. That's right, no cap on the 3% match. No cap. Robinhood Gold gets you the most for your retirement thanks to the IRA with the 3% match. This offer is good through April 30th. Get started at robinhood.com/boost. Subscription fees apply. And now for some legal info. Claim as a Q1 2024 as validated by Radius Global Market Research. Investing involves some risk, including loss. Limitations apply to IRAs, 401ks. 3% match requires Robinhood Gold for 1 year from the date of the first 3% match. Must keep Robinhood IRA for 5 years. 3% match transfers subject terms and conditions. Robinhood IRA available to U.S. customers in good standing. Robinhood Financial LLC, member SIPC, is registered broker-dealer. All right. And moving on to Tech, I do think it's interesting to remember that the last time these two teams played, Houston was kind of reeling. And I mean that to say that Houston had just lost a couple of road games. It looked like this conference was going to be a bigger beatdown than even anyone anticipated. And then they show up and play Tech, who at the time was actually a tied for top rank in the conference team. They'd played different teams to that point in the conference, Houston and Tech had, but they're a good basketball team. And Jamal Shead decided that it was not going to be a loss. He just came out of that game. He had 29 points, 10 assists, and frankly, no one on Texas Tech's roster could cover him. And I think that we're looking at a semifinal game on Friday in which very likely could have the same kind of outcome, the same kind of result in terms of him being the single one-on-one matchup because while Houston's roster has changed over some, Jamal Shead is still Jamal Shead, and Texas Tech is still Texas Tech. Now, Tech has other talented basketball players, but I don't think they've got any like new scheme they're going to have that puts out there to cover Jamal Shead unless it's helping over a lot from other positions and trying to double team, get the ball out of his hands. It's hard to do that with a point guard, a true point guard, get the ball out of his hands, especially when you factor in that like in the first matchup, he didn't just have the 29 points, he had the 10 assists, but that will rely some on those shots falling from Cryer and Sharp, like we mentioned. I don't bet on those guys shoot poorly 2 days in a row. And so I'd imagine this could be the kind of game we see Cryer go 5 of 8 or something, like who knows, right? But that's, I think, the only game plan difference Tech is going to be able to have here because this felt more like a personnel issue than a game plan issue. In the first game, Houston was also able to turn Tech over, force 14 turnovers, and allowed just 8 points in the paint for a team that really only had like one decent 3-point shooter that shot high percentage on high volume. And so Houston did a great job of cutting off driving lanes and playing solid, stout post defense in there. In the first matchup, again, only 8 points in the paint compared to what TCU just did, where almost all of their points were in the paint. Or on the free throw line, I should say. I do think that it was interesting to see in that first matchup, if you go back and watch some, and I watched some of it, the YouTube like expedited highlight thing, where it's like 12 minutes worth of clips to remind myself what was going on there. They held Joe Toussaint to 1 of 2 from 3 and Pop Isaac to 12 points. That is like where a bulk of the Texas Tech scoring comes from, and that's in large part due to Emmanuel Sharp Emmanuel Sharp at Isaac for a lot of the marks, and then you had Jamal Shead on Joe Toussaint. They were able to swarm the ball every time it got to different corners, and then like the low block monster traps and those kinds of things really, really flustered Texas Tech. I know that Texas Tech has seen this before, seen the Houston defense before, but it's also been months at this point, and so I wonder if like you can remind yourself of what the speed was like. but having not seen it in months, having seen Houston work through the kinks here, kind of shake the rust off on Thursday, I feel like Houston's actually going to have a similar type of defensive performance in this game. I also think it's worth pointing out that it's interesting we're playing TCU and now Tech, and we'll see who we play potentially on Saturday in a championship game if they were to beat Tech. But against both TCU and Tech, with the exception of really that final play against TCU in which he probably should have tapped the ball back to Jamal instead of trying to take the shot himself, Damian Dunn really played very well in both games. And I thought he played pretty well in stretches of the second TCU game. And now we're looking at the Texas Tech game. I thought he played really well in the first matchup. And he had 28 minutes on the floor because of it, 4 rebounds and 2 steals. And I know that's not a lot in 28 minutes if you're trying to go stats per minute or whatever. But I do think it's indicative of the effort he played with in that game. And so I think that you'll see more bench play out of him and Malik. Malik was not working as well into the lineup at that point in the season when they played the first time. This is his previous school. I also think he's playing at better this year. He's kind of found more of his footing. We're putting him more of the stretch 4 spot as opposed to backup point guard spot. And that's clearly played to his strengths more. The size will be a bigger factor in this one as well. We saw Houston get out rebounding against TCU, playing a lot of small ball forwards. That's just kind of the hand we're dealt right now with injuries. And I think that it's interesting to look at what positives does Malik bring when he is playing that small ball 4? He clearly gets up and is deflecting and deterring and blocking shots at the rim. Ends up being a pretty strong rebounder for us for the same kind of athletic reasons. On the whole, okay, I do think it's worth pointing out that in the first matchup, both JoJo Tugler and Ramon Walker played over 10 minutes apiece. Tugler had only 4 fouls. He actually might have played the full 20 between those two guys instead of having Ramon play the 10. But here or there, both those guys are hurt this matchup. And so I imagine you'll see Houston go to Sedlot early, kind of like they did in the TCU game, get him involved in the screener. I mentioned the set earlier that got Cryer and Sharp on some flare screen actions while also having a pick and roll action. I imagine that's the kind of stuff you're going to look at and see a lot more of Houston going forward because they're pretty much always going to have a true center on the floor. And J1 can do it. Obviously, he did it last year. I don't know if Jamal Shedd's going to get 29 points himself this game, right? 29 points himself with 10 assists. It's hard to ask out of anyone. I mean, the NBA, that's hard to ask out of anyone. But I do think that there's room to be made up in the scoring. If you go back and watch the first matchup, Sharp and Cryer, for all the assists that Jamal had, actually didn't score the ball that well. I could easily see one of them getting hot from 3 this game and kind of a redistribution of that 29 points. I do think Jamal Shedd's going to need to have the kind of game where he gets the 10 assists again, though, and where those assists go to and come from will be a little bit different. I don't know this is a gigantic game from a scoring perspective. From your true center, Texas Tech plays very, very big inside and, frankly, long and athletic as well. Houston was able to put him in a blender as far as on the pick and roll. Does he cover Jamal? Does he sink back? How hard does he drop? How hard does he hedge? And that kind of stuff. I imagine they've coached that up. I would imagine Tech has gotten better over the course of the season and will be better in that aspect. The way to take advantage of that is to now work the ball around the perimeter on swing passes and take advantage of the rotating defenses and things like that. In the first matchup, because they pulled that big guy out on the perimeter for the pick and roll, Houston was able to win the rebounding battle 38-28. And I think that they're going to have to do something to that effect again, which is, again, why I think you'll see Sedlot early and often in this one. Schematically, I've said that I think they'll find guys in 3-point and in the corner for 3-pointers and stuff like that. I think it's worth pointing out that Houston scored 77 points in the first matchup and only shot 3 free throws. Offensively, Houston's going to find ways to score. The issues for Texas Tech are personnel issues. They just are going to have trouble staying in front of Houston. The issue will be offensive rebounding from TCU, can't bleed over into this game because Texas Tech's going to shoot better than 23%, right? That's not going to be the same kind of game. Issue is going to be that can you keep Pop Isaacs to just 12 points, right? Because he's had games of over 30 this season, right? The issue is going to be can you keep Joe Toussaint of one just to where he's shooting 1 or 2 from 3 and under 10 points because he's kind of a key part of their offensive scoring load over there at Texas Tech. I think those things will all go their way, and I think that Houston comes out and plays a very normal Houston game. They win this game by like 16 points. If you factor in the fact that it's a neutral floor and that there's a lot on the line for Texas Tech and they're playing for seeding in the March Madness tournament, stuff like that, it might be closer to 8 or 10. I feel fairly confident in this game, though, especially now that we know Houston is not going to be resting their guys or playing for the next tournament down the line. And I think that's really an interesting development. So I want to talk some about that in the third segment. But first, I want to talk to you about some of our buddies, including Amazon Fire TV, which is what I've been watching the start of March Madness on myself, because Fire TV is your destination for sports, from live games highlights to in-depth analysis. Fire TV offers amazing viewing experiences with smart TVs, as well as the Fire Stick TV that you can plug into your existing TV and provide access to millions of movies, TV episodes, as well as live TV and more. Whether it's opening weekend for baseball, which is coming up, college basketball tournament, which we're in, or about to be in the big one, or you're going to want to watch all those things on Fire TV. Fire TV recently created Fire TV channels to deliver a constant supply of the latest videos from your favorite sports brands, all for free. That includes all of us at Locked On. Yeah, we're on there. And most of the big pro leagues and college conferences as well. Fire TV channels let you dive into all of the game analysis, highlights, and more. Keep updated on the latest of the world of sports, from March Madness, the NBA, the MLB, and more. Not to mention great news, entertainment, gaming, travel, cooking videos as well. Check out Fire TV and Fire TV and Alexa devices. If you haven't checked out Fire TV channels, you should. Trust me on this. To learn more, go to amazon.com/LockedOnFireTV. All right, the other thing I got to talk to you a little bit about as our buddies over at FanDuel, because it is March. And you can say goodbye to busted brackets because FanDuel lets you bet on every game of the tourney. Not just all at once, every single game as you go. Whether betting on a big upset or a 1 seed, it's time to get dancing on America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. They've upped it, guys. That's $200 to use on point spreads, money lines. You can even pick who's going to win it all. Right now, the odds are shrinking for Houston. Houston's getting to be better, not quite 50-50 even, but you got to go to sportsbook. Got to go to FanDuel Sportsbook to check it out. You can even pick who's going to win it all over there. Just pick Houston. Trust me, feel better about it. It's what you're rooting for anyway. Might as well put your money where my mouth is. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn and bet college hoops until they cut down the nets. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. All right. Houston dabbled in sitting guys, and I want to talk about that because that was interesting. That frankly, we had the conversation on Thursday's episode about if they would rest guys or not, and what the pros and cons of that were. And out the gate, it was kind of undecided in this game, in the TCU game, right? Sedlot comes in a couple minutes in early, and it looks like, okay, what's this rotation going to be? And then you look at the minutes distribution, and you see that, Damian Dunn plays 18, Malik Wilson plays 22. And you're like, wait a second, like, is that an indication of rest? And I don't actually think that Houston is going with that because Sedlot only ended up playing just under 10 minutes. But I do think it's interesting in the post game that when asked about it, Kelvin Sampson said that they thought about it, because I think to this point there'd been kind of a fairly solid consensus that it was antithetical to Houston's culture to even dabble in that, right? And I do think that at a full strength roster, that's probably fair, right? Like that's not who this team is. That's not who the DNA is. That's not what they're ever going to do. I do think, though, that a big part of the problem is it's not like one or two guys were hurt, right? This roster is kind of constructed in the current way, in a sense that, like, you can't really rest guys. It'd be more about the style of play and the way you played, and that it's almost worth pointing out that, like, if they'd arrested guys, the only things you could have really done more or played a lot more like 15 or 16 minutes and played Ryan Elvin more like 7 or 8 minutes. I'm not saying I was opposed to doing that, but I think that having so many injuries actually also played a factor in this in a way that I maybe didn't predict beforehand, right? Where Houston was looking at like, should we rest guys or not? And it's like, well, if Jamal Shedd's going to end up playing 30 plus minutes anyway, why would we do this anybody else? And I think that there's kind of a couple factors there. For one obviously is like, you've got to play 5 on the floor. You can't play 4 on 5, even though it feels like it at times with the rebounding effort in TCU. Felt like TCU had a bunch of guys at the rebound ball that couldn't shoot. But also, truthfully, and this is probably the more depressing way to look at it, is, even when you're resting guys, someone could, twist an ankle, knock on wood or whatever, right? And ultimately, you're kind of at the point in your roster where, like, if anyone goes down, it's over. And I don't mean anyone. I mean, you just don't have the depth. You can't do anything else, right? You can't go find. It's not the NBA. You can't go sign a 10-day contract on a hardship or anything like that. You're just kind of done. And I think at that point in the season, you just kind of say, like, you could potentially twist your ankle at practice. You could potentially twist your ankle in the first minute of the game as a starter, right? Like, we just got to go. And I think that that's a fair way to go about it. And as depressing as to think about, like, this team is incredibly talented, and at a full strength roster, the FanDuel odds are nearly a 1-to-1 on if they'd win it all or not right now. It might almost be negative money if they had a full roster. I just look at this team and think, okay, but with Sedlaw being your 8th guy, even if Sedlaw were to have to miss time with a funny bone hit or something, because you don't want to wish actual injuries on anybody, but like, that hurts you, and that's wild to think and say, but that's just kind of where we're at. And if that's the case, might as well play, right? Might as well play it out. I hope none of that happens, but I think that it'll be easy to play armchair, I would say Monday morning quarterback, but it's obviously not that. But everyone's a great coach from the couch, right? And so you'll sit there and think, okay, they should have done this, should have done that. I think it's interesting to think that Kelvin even dabbled in the thought. In the post-game press conference, he mentioned that they had thought about it. They've got guys, like he mentioned, Sedlot, not by name, but somewhat by description, as a guy that, like, realistically should have been able to redshirt this year and not play at all. He doesn't play a pretty crucial role. Houston keeps winning, and so that's the positive of it all. But I wonder if I look at this, as I look at this, like, when do the minutes start to accumulate to be too much? Now, obviously, the championship game itself is on Saturday, and they don't play again until the earliest part of March Madness would be on Thursday of the next week. So you have some time to kind of get off your legs and get off your feet. It's just the accumulation of wear and tear on things. The scary thing is going to be, like, when they're a 1 seed on Thursday or Friday and they're playing a 16 seed, they can't add guys to their bench in that game either. So guys can play lots of minutes in those games, even if they're, up by a lot of points. And so maybe this is kind of working through that and saying, hey, we got to play who we play, and that's how we got to go. But I circle back to, I think I got a lot of criticism on Thursday for just presenting, like, the idea, like, hey, they might do this thing. And people are like, what are you talking about? And it sounds like in the postgame that Kelvin agreed they at least thought about it. They just couldn't. And so interesting to see that, like, even they're thinking about those kinds of things. And even they, for what it's worth, are looking at, how can we maximize the potential of this roster with what we have left. Now, be live tweeting the Texas Tech game later today. Obviously, as we go into the weekend and more basketball as well, I'm sitting in a family member's basement in a different state, different home. But I'll be hoping to get to you more and more this weekend as more and more basketball happens. We'll be bringing the latest on the Houston Cougars each and every day here via some vehicle at Locked On Coogs. So make sure you subscribe, like, and comment on the videos. Hit the bell so you know if we ever go live, which we might. We'll see. We'll see how that goes. And as always, Locked On Coogs is a proud member of the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, our Cougs, our number one in America. Cougs, our banged up Houston Cougars each and every day. Go Cougs.